Hello, welcome back to Teaching in Real Time. How well does the American federal system respond to public health crises? We've had a great webinar series so far. Last week, we identified some of the principles that were connected to our governmental responses to public health crises. We connected the idea of federalism to other core concepts in our system of government. Then on Wednesday of last week, I don't know about the rest of you, but I was really kind of surprised by the number and scope of historical episodes, pandemics in our nation's history, and the ways in which various governments have responded to them. Sessions 1 and 2 were really to get everyone ready for this session, which focuses on today, which is the real-time part of the webinar. Before we get to introducing Stephen Schechter, I did want to show you, I gave you a link for this in the email. And so just click on the link and you can sign up for the We the People textbook. It's completely free and you can at least take a look at it. Ken Thomas and Matt Christensen and Robert Lemming will be talking more about that tomorrow night. And then two, also, if you need certification for your professional development hours, we are assigning or certifying 6 professional development hours. Just email me separately and I'd be happy to provide you with a certificate, that along with the outline, and you should be in good shape for receiving credit for your participation in the series of webinars. So without further ado, and again, I'll remind you, we realize that you'll have probably more questions during this session than even the other sessions. They've been excellent questions, and just utilize the chat or Q&A, and we'll interrupt Dr. Schechter, a couple times and ask questions, and we'll certainly save time at the end for questions as well. So without further ado, Dr. Schechter, we're ready for you.
Thank you, Dr. Vance. It's a pleasure to be back with you and with what are now 49 participants, which ain't bad. And last week, when we started, the first session was on concepts and conceptual development, federalism and separation of powers, constitutionalism, pluralism, civil liberties, and their interrelationships and why they're important in public health policy, and why public health policy is important to those institutions as well. The next day, we looked at historical development of public health policy in first the colonies and then the early nation and on to today. The idea being that ideas matter and that history matters, both for their own sake, but also in studying current issues like how the spread of COVID-19 is managed and how well it's managed. So if you remember, I'll just repeat a few main points. If you weren't with us then, listen up. A few of the main points that we've stressed so far and will stress today is that pandemics and infections have been a part of American history from the early 1630s. There have been a variety of such pandemics and epidemics in each historical period. Over the course of those historical periods, the American response that evolved was first, responses were made by local communities, and then by colonial governments, the colonial governments passing early legislation and regulation and developing administrative structures to assist local governments. The federal government became involved in the 1790s after the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. Federal government's early involvement and involvement for decades was in the form of marine hospitals that enforced their powers of monitoring ports, seaports, obviously, but today airports. It's one of actually the primary on-the-ground ways in which the federal government sees and controls what's going on in the management of infectious diseases. Over time, federal government became involved in other ways, including providing federal assistance to states and local governments, and eventually expertise through the precursors of the CDC and NIH. Eventually some regulations, but not too many, and it hasn't gotten much more regulatory today. So the federal government played a secondary role. States and local governments played the primary role in controlling infectious diseases throughout American history, and they're doing it now. So if you're curious why states and localities, they have the historical experience, they have the capacity, they're on the ground, they respond to local diversity. Are they able to set national policies in the interest of uniformity? No, they're not. Does that happen? Well, it does through the CDC and CDC guidelines. It's just a question as to whether the politicians allow those guidelines to stand. And that's been the case throughout American history. One of the unsung heroes of public health history are administrators in your county health departments, your city health departments, if you're in cities, state health departments, and in the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you very much. One thing I did not get to last time precisely is the governing principle and question that all this variety of governmental involvement stirs. It's a question that was posed by a great American political thinker named Martin Diamond. And the question is, by which, and it has to do with public health problems, environmental problems, any public problems. And the question is this: by which government or combination of governments should this or that part of a public problem be addressed? Namely, who does what and why? We'll be coming back to that question over and over again. I'm sure you each have your own views, having lived through this public health crisis, and before that, earlier wake-up calls in natural disasters, Katrina and other natural disasters, and 9/11. And regardless of the public problem, it comes down to the question, who does what and why? So we've looked at the who, that is federal, state, county, and local governments. There are 4. And special districts, of which the main one for our purposes is school districts. But what's the what? What are the aspects of a public health crisis that these governments have to decide who's going to do what? And Happily, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services supplied a very clear answer to that question, and the parts are 6 in number, and they're listed before you. The 7th is my own, and it has to do with what's known as cross-cutting dimensions. That is to say, for each of these problems and their relationships, who's going to do the planning, who's going to do the coordination, who's going to set the regulations and the guidelines, who's going to pay for it, and who's going to be on the ground to administer it directly or contract the administration out, as is more and more common these days with government. We'll be coming back to these problems, but they'll help us as we look at this grid, which shows federal, state, and local governments, their roles, and their limits. Impossible to think about roles of federal and state and local governments in managing public health crises in the abstract, but now we have some concrete examples, these 6, to lend practicality and concreteness to filling out this table, which we're not going to do now, but I offer it up to you as something that you could have your students working on when school starts back up again in whatever form it does. As we talked about last time, in deciding who does what, we don't come at it with an empty slate. We come at it with preconceived notions of who should do what. And there are 3 basic views of who should do what. There's the centrist view. That is the view that says, well, we've got a problem. It's reaching national proportions. It involves germs. Germs know no boundaries. So ipso facto, it ought to be the national government that dictates these responses to these 6 problem areas. And they'll bring states and localities into their plan, whether by choice or by force. That's the centrist argument. The decentrist argument is, oh my goodness, have you looked at the national government lately? Do you want the national government you see on television every day? A divided Congress and a divided president actually responsible for dealing with something as serious as a public health crisis, when you have the states and localities who have been doing it for over 350 years? Give me a break. Then there's the Federalist argument, which says, you know, this is the Madisonian argument, you know, human nature, nobody's an angel. Put them in a government office and they don't suddenly become any more angelic. They just become non-angels with more power. So, you know, thank goodness we have a national government, a federal government, states, localities, counties, so they can check and balance each other's non-angelic behavior and inefficiencies on the ground. That would be the Federalist argument. I tried to make them all equally persuasive. Did I succeed, Thomas? Could you tell which one I would prefer?
I think you've succeeded, Dr. Schechter. No,
Thank you very much. Thank you. Lest you think that the national government is somehow not a patchwork of responses and that only the states are a patchwork of responses, I am here to share with you that they are both a patchwork of responses, and states and localities, you hear from the news that there are patchwork because there are 50 states and there are how many local governments? Bob? Tom? Dorothy? There are 89,000. So little wonder they're a patchwork. But if you look at this image, they are the cover pages of the existing federal public health plans to be put in place in the event of an infectious disease just before COVID-19. And if you can count them up, there are 11 that have cover pictures here. There are actually more than 11. They're all in effect. They're all administered by different federal agencies, and they're a patchwork too. When it came time to talk about how to plan for COVID, each and every one of these was rejected by the White House. So I think Madison had a pretty good point when he thought we ought to balance patchworks and inefficiencies and variety and diversity and uniformity all in one. That's a good slide, Thomas. If you go back to the We the People Unit 4 question guiding this discussion, it is, what federalism issues does COVID-19 raise, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of federalism and unitarism as principles for managing COVID-19? This grid prepares us to consider advantages and disadvantages of federalism and unitarism. Federalism is, again, the political variation of unity and diversity. Federalism seeks to create a national government in the interests of uniformity, and state and local governments in the interests of diversity, all framed by constitutions, plural, that give them their powers and also set their limits. But what is unitarism? If you've ever taught a civics course, the standard answer is unitarism is a principle governing a unitary system like France or China, in which all governing authority is centralized in one national government and delegated or mandated by that government to subordinate provincial and local governments. And then the teacher proudly proclaims, hey, we're a federal system, so we're not a unitary system, so we can go on to something else because unitarism doesn't apply here, which is not entirely true. In fact, it's not true at all. Last time we looked at exclusive powers given to the federal government in the United States Constitution. And we also looked at exclusive powers given to the states by their constitutions and by the federal Constitution. These exclusive powers, if you think it through, an exclusive power follows the principle of unitarism. It says, hey, this power is centralized to your level, It is yours. Do with it what you will, as long as you behave constitutionally in its execution. The Postal Service, exclusive power. The Foreign Service, exclusive power. There's an element of unitarism in there. There's also an element of unitarism in another constitutional principle called preemption, which is the idea that the federal government can occupy, quote unquote, either partially or completely, an area of public policy that it deems necessary to preempt, and the Constitution upholds, as do the courts if it goes to a lawsuit. An example of preemption would be an obvious one, which you may not have thought of, but as soon as I say it, it'll be obvious. The federal government totally, completely occupies the field of disposing of high-level nuclear waste, right? I mean, you want your local mayor doing it? No, the federal government decides where it goes. Federal government is involved in, completely controls putting it in trucks and sending the trucks out and burying it in salt deposits out in the Southwest, and states like Arizona and New Mexico have absolutely no say in the matter, and frankly, you don't want them to have any say in the matter. It can be complete preemption, can be partial, can be temporary, and it can be permanent. So now, if we can go back to those 6 aspects of public health management. So the question is, should these be managed by the federal principle or the unitary principle? Should they be in the hands of the national government or in the hands of state and local governments? The answer becomes a bit more nuanced, because taken one at a time, there's a good chance that each one could have a slightly different answer to the question, which government or combination of governments is going to plan, coordinate, regulate, finance, and administer this or that, this surveillance, testing, tracking, and containment, and so on, and so on, and so forth. So it provides a more nuanced answer to the question, should public health crises be managed by the principle of federalism or unitarism, by the national government, states and localities, or some combination of the two? And the answer to all those questions is a resounding yes. But it depends on the circumstances and the particular task at hand, which takes us to the role of not government, but public officials, and that is good judgment. Having the brains God gave them to decide these questions together. And believe it or not, that's what they've done over the course of history. And if you go back to those 6 for a second, I will just state for the record that number 5 and 6 were permanently preempted by the federal government and administered by the FDA, right? I mean, federal government is responsible for the regulation of all drugs, totally and completely, except marijuana, which is sort of out there. And number 4, is the Defense Production Act, which you've heard about, which gives the federal government partial quasi-preemption to tell the private sector what to do in terms of developing and producing equipment needed for a public health crisis, as you saw in the news a couple of months ago. Thomas, you can ask me a question.
Could we also use, as an example of unitarism, the idea that the courts have played a role in furthering unitarism when, case by case, certain fundamental rights come before the Supreme Court, and we've incorporated them through the Due Process Clause. In essence, we've nationalized, unitarized most of the rights in the Bill of Rights. That's a reasonable thing to say, right?
That is a reasonable thing to say, not just simply courtesy of the courts out of the goodness of their heart, but the 14th Amendment had something to do with it too.
No, I got that. Yeah, through the Due Process Clause. And the way it's kind of presented, I think, in most textbooks and for most of us teachers is that, you know, anything that is in the Constitution and is delegated to the national government is certainly a power of the national government. And then there's this whole host of other things like rights, like therapeutics and like vaccinations and so forth that are so important countrywide that unity wins out over diversity. Is that a fair claim?
Yes. Yes, it is. That takes us, actually, that could take us to our next question. Can the federal government override state and local action as concerns COVID? Are there particular grounds by which the federal government can take Tom's point of some measures absolutely and totally requiring unity, that diverse state and local policies can be overridden? It's a perfectly reasonable question. Except the answer is probably no. And the courts over the past several months have basically supported that the answer is probably, or usually, or under most circumstances, the federal government cannot override state and local COVID-19 policies. Take a look first at preemption. Federal government preempted drug manufacture and certification and licensing and the like. Can it suddenly preempt any of the other of the six? Or equipment they can quasi-preempt. Any of the other three? No. Courts are not going to suddenly let the federal government come in and completely take over a field that is so important as public health, with such a backup support called the police power and so much state experience just out of the blue. It's not going to happen. Can the federal government tell states and localities what to do? Seems to be, the answer should be yes, one might think. But for the courts, the answer is absolutely not. The federal government may not tell as in dictate, or to states and localities what to do, nor may they commandeer them into federal service. Can the federal government veto a state law, state policy? No, it can't. Madison, if some of you remember, tried to get a federal veto worked into the Constitution and was voted down. Can the federal government use emergency orders to move states and localities to action? Yes, it can. Can it move states and localities to open up their economies at a time when those states in question don't meet the CDC guidelines? Absolutely not. No court's going to say, yes, the federal government can make states and localities open up even when it's unsafe to do so. Can the federal government, through its emergency power, urge states to close now? Can the federal government urge Florida to close up shop? Maybe. Can the federal government use its disaster management authority to help Florida close up? Yes, it can. If you remember, the president declared a national disaster at the sort of the outset of COVID-19 federal policies. Can the CDC do something? Well, the CDC can't override state and local action, but the CDC has very clear guidelines that it urges states and localities to follow. If states and localities don't follow CDC guidelines, the CDC can cite them for a public health violation. Will that amount to anything? No, unless we go down to number 7. If there's further federal assistance to states and localities, which is going to be decided by Congress, can Congress, in passing that federal assistance, attach a condition to the federal assistance, the grants and loans, that says any state not complying with CDC guidelines will not receive this money? Can Congress do that? Absolutely, it can. Has it been done in the past? Often. There are hundreds and hundreds of conditions. Conservative Republican President Ronald Reagan put such condition in effect for receiving transportation assistance when it came time to set age limits for alcohol consumption, if some of you remember back that far. Can the federal government use interstate commerce and the due process clause to override state and local action? It hasn't happened yet in however many hundreds and decades of years we've had the US Constitution. But it could. If states close their economies senselessly without good reason, and that burdens interstate commerce or the due process clause, federal government could intercede. It's already interceded, though, not using those two clauses, but using the Privileges and Immunities Clause, as when Hawaii passed a state law that requires a 14-day quarantine for anyone coming into the state during this pandemic. There are two lawsuits against that law, one on due process grounds and one on privileges and immunities grounds. The one on privileges and immunities grounds argues that Hawaii has gone against the privileges and immunities of non-Hawaiians, of people out of state, by requiring them to submit themselves to a 14-day quarantine if they're coming into Hawaii. Attorney General Barr actually wrote a friend of the court brief on privileges and immunities grounds. He attached it to the due process case, which the court was a little, let's say the court decided to consolidate the two cases, not to embarrass the US Justice Department for attaching one set of grounds to a case involving another set of grounds, which is something you don't want to do. So I guess there I've made a personal opinion known. And that is, no, I won't say the personal opinion. Yes, I will. You really don't want to look stupid in front of a judge. I worked for the Chief Judge of New York State, and he would constantly come to me and say how upset he was with lawyers who acted stupid. That was a stupid thing to do. But even more stupid is the fact that the state law requires quarantine by anyone coming in from out of the state. So I have a good friend who's Hawaiian. He went out of state. He came in, and he had to self-quarantine at home for 14 days. So I'm not sure where privileges and immunities comes into play when Hawaiians and non-Hawaiians alike are required to self-quarantine for 14 days. But I'm sorry, I've spent too much time on this one.
We do have Dr. Schechter, we do have an excellent question before we get too far down the road. And this question related to some of your earlier statements. You know, you talked about the patchwork of federal plans predating the pandemic. This participant asks, but isn't it true that the current administration jettisoned the Obama's plans and experience with Ebola? And so isn't it fair to teach, really, that the current administration was ill-prepared to fulfill their national role in helping state and local governments receive adequate directions and resources to deal with COVID-19. So it's a more specific example of the executive branch turning a blind eye to, or rejecting even, the previous administration's plans to deal with Ebola, and has that thrown a wrench into our national response, or would our national response be somewhat similar even without that?
That's a three-part question. First, yes. Presidents oughtn't to ignore the work of past administrations, but learn from them. So there's a yes. At the same time, Congress was not particularly on the job in terms of passing the legislation that it should have been passing in terms of assisting state and local governments. At the same time, those state and local governments were ill prepared when they first came on the scene. I mean, I'm from New York. So fair is fair. Mayor de Blasio, a Democrat, and Governor Cuomo, a Democrat, blew off the initial weeks of COVID in New York City and surrounding areas because who knows? The statements by Mayor de Blasio were kind of reminiscent of mayoral responses to 9/11, namely, we will not be kowtowed by an enemy that is beyond our borders and has just come into our borders unwanted, as if a COVID-19 germ was a terrorist that could be taught a lesson, and New Yorkers could be New York tough. So yes to the original question, but let's spread the blame fairly. And there's almost every player in this game that deserves some blame for their initial delays, inefficiency, and bad judgment. There.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
I'll pass over the compact clause, the supremacy clause, which you teach in school. Might be interpreted to say, yes, the federal government can override state and local action, except the federal government has no real authority. States and localities have the authority. So the supremacy clause doesn't really apply in this circumstance. So I just want, it seems like the obvious thing to do when there's a national crisis that knows no state borders is that the federal government takes things over and handles it. But I wanted to show you step by step by step how constitutionally and practically that sort of thinking isn't applicable to this particular set of circumstances. And I hope I've done that. Local governments are a player in this. I've been speaking about federal government and localities. I won't spend too much time on this except for the fact that in most states, local governments are creatures of their state government. If states be so foolish, local governments can be merged, abolished, consolidated, if state legislatures were so foolish. Some states have a slightly more balanced system in which they have not just this principle, but a measure of home rule as well. Kansas is one such example. There are a few states that have complete home rule for local governments. But in most instances, in this particular crisis and other public health crises, local governments are supposed to follow state policy. Newspapers and televisions and media stories are filled with examples where they don't, right? Where the mayor of Atlanta, the mayor of, in Georgia, the mayor of a city in Florida says, look it, we can't have the kind of openness of our local economies that the governor wants because it's becoming very, very unsafe. And if it's a matter of following safety or the governor, we're on the side of safety. So the mayors and commissioners and managers, local managers, in more and more instances are following their conscience. Some of those are going to go to court. In most instances, the governor and the legislature is going to look away and let the local governments follow their own lights. We can go to the next slide if you would. As I mentioned last week, we all know that businesses are involved. What are businesses doing in terms of their reopening? It's sort of an interesting commentary that if anyone is following CDC guidelines on reopening, it's businesses, both serving the public and businesses like factories that are bringing back employees. As in most instances, there's a good reason and a real reason for following guidelines. The real reason is that is lawsuits. Tort law in the United States is going through a very interesting time in which you have lots and lots of private employers opening up, whether it be restaurants or shops or factories, and not wanting to get sued and going back to their state legislatures and lobbying Congress so that they don't get sued. And next in line are going to be school districts who are going to have to be doing the same. I mean, if schools open up and kids come back and kids get sick and die, or they can be proven they come home and infect their grandmother who's living at home, who dies, there's going to be hell to pay. School districts are going to have to, well, not going to have to be concerned. No one has to tell them to do it, but they're going to be concerned. Be prepared to ask a few questions if we don't get many from participants. Okay, I'm ready. Everything going all right here, Tom? I put him to sleep. Oh my gosh.
Fantastic. No, it just takes.
I put him to sleep. I can't imagine what's happening out there among the now 62 participants we have.
It took me a while to find my mute button.
The what?
My mute button.
Ah. Okay. Is there a question for me?
Hawaii, since it's a group of islands, doesn't it make sense to take advantage of their geography by having everybody coming in and out of quarantine?
Oh, someone asked a question about the fact that, to go back to the Hawaii case, there are so many islands. And, Thomas, wouldn't you know, it turns out that some of those islands have a higher COVID case rate and mortality rate than other islands. So the question is, you know, what's good for the goose? If interstate arrivals have to self-quarantine, should people traveling from a high infectious island to another lesser infectious island have to self-quarantine? And that is, that's a subject of great debate in Hawaii, and it's part of these two cases.
But the same logic could be applied to,
Sure.
a higher infection rate in Kansas City than there is in
Right.
County where I am.
Right,
So same thing could apply eventually.
right.
Professor Schechter, can I just jump in here? The question, I think, was because Hawaii is a group of islands, doesn't it make sense that that Hawaii can decide to keep, because their, geography is separate from the mainland United States, doesn't it make sense that they can take advantage of their geographical isolation by having everyone coming in and out quarantine?
Yes, it does make sense.
Okay. All right.
And you kind of know that I'm going to say but. Maine has such a law. New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey just put in place such orders. So, and they're all different. The New York, New Jersey, Connecticut compact executive orders are, quote unquote, in constitutional language, narrowly tailored to people coming into their state from high infectious states, highly infected states. And generally, constitutional lawyers are of the opinion that that one is very likely to hold up in court because it is narrowly tailored to a particular problem. Not so sure about Maine. North Carolina has an interesting one. Every state is different in terms of its geography. North Carolina appeals to snowbirds. And those snowbirds are buying up vacation, second, and even primary homes. North Carolina put in place a law that says that out-of-staters who own property in North Carolina can't use that property. That seems to be kind of the shakiest of the bunch. But they are a bunch, and they are interesting.
And we do eventually have to get to the whole idea of mask wearing, which is a hot button topic, but I'm sure you'll get there.
I'll do mask wearing. We can do that now if you like.
Do mask wearing. I mean, that at least where I live, and again, I live out in the, for those of you who don't know me, I live in Wamego, Kansas, and you know, it's a small town of 5,000 people. It's in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, and it's really, at least here, and again, I know that it's not like the rest of the country in many ways, but it's a political statement here. You know, I went in to pick up some takeout at the local bar down here in Wamego, and the place was packed. This was a week ago, and the place was packed Friday night, not even a week ago, and nobody had a mask on. And you know, I didn't either, to be honest with you. I should have, but I didn't either. But I felt like I would have been embarrassed if I would have had a mask on. People would have looked at me funny or something. I don't know. It's a political issue.
It is. We could all agree it's a political issue. And now what I want you to do is formulate the question that is on the minds of the 64 participants regarding mask wearing.
Well, I guess the question would be, is it the role of any government to require wearing masks in this particular set of circumstances? And if it is the role of government, which government should take charge of requiring mask wearing?
Thomas?
Yes?
That is a really well-formulated question.
I've hung out with you for 20 years.
Does government have the power? We'll do this as a legal question. Does government have the power to require its citizens to wear masks in public? My first answer is, I don't know. It's up to the court to decide. Would I hazard a guess? It's certainly up to states and local governments and the federal government have certainly until now gotten away with quote unquote urging people to wear masks. So urging's definitely in. So what you're talking about is taking that leap from urging to requiring, yes?
Yeah, and from where I sit, I don't see what would stop either the national government or state or local governments from doing that. Now, there's two different questions here. One is whether or not they have the power to do it. The other is would it be wise to do
Right.
that?
Let me answer.
You're on the power thing first.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I don't see any individual right here at stake wearing a mask. I guess you could claim that it restricts your free speech rights or something, but I don't see why a state, local, or the national government, for all that matter, wouldn't be allowed to do that.
So on the power question,
under these circumstances.
On the power question, then, if it doesn't violate a clearly apparent right, which it does not seem to, there does not seem to be such a right that it would violate, save for free choice, freedom of choice. Then it would be determined by the court on the basis of what's known as the rational basis test, right?
Ding, ding, ding.
Does that bring back?
And that's a rubber stamp for governmental action. That's the court basically saying yes to whatever the governmental action is. So
no, I wouldn't go quite that far, but you'd have to go it step by step. And the first sub question is, does the law serve a legitimate government purpose? Let's just go through this step by step. Does it serve a legitimate government purpose? And I'm sure that everyone in the room would say, sure, yeah.
There
are some, however, who would say, hey, way back when, I distinctly remember Dr. Fauci standing up and saying in his very honest, logical, straightforward manner, look, folks, wearing a mask is well, it would serve a legitimate government purpose. Let's bring up
absolutely would.
Let's bring up Dr. Fauci on the second question. Are the means chosen rationally related to those legitimate purposes? That's where Dr. Fauci had originally said, look, it's not going to stop you from getting the germs unless you have one of these super masks. And even then, it's not foolproof. But, if it makes you feel good, wear it. And then later down the road, he recanted. So people in Kansas who don't wear masks and happen to watch PBS, which is about 3 people, would say, he said this wasn't going to do any good. He recanted. I'm going to interpret his recant as a political deceit. And therefore, I don't have to wear the mask because it's not rationally related to the legitimate government purpose involved. And if we're just sitting around after 9 o'clock having a few drinks, I might agree with him. To be honest.
But the courts wouldn't Ken, let me just get in one point, then I'll turn things over to you. But the courts probably wouldn't. We have, the courts would probably say, okay, I'm just telling you, I'm 99% confident the courts.
Wait, I'm sorry, Tom. Tom, if I may, let me just go to the second question and get that into the mix.
Well, before you go on, there's a great question here. I heard it on TV. It must be a good question because I heard it on TV. And it says, isn't wearing a mask comparable to helmet laws or seatbelts in cars or no smoking in public places?
Contraceptive devices?
No, not
Yes.
contraceptive.
No?
No, that's settled con law now. Griswold versus Connecticut. But isn't that's a decent point, isn't it?
Yes, it's a very, very good point.
Okay. Ken Thomas, sorry, I interrupted. I just wanted to get that question in from a participant. Ken, you were going to say.
Yeah, and we obviously have to look at the precedent here that in the courts, all the way back to English common law and the idea of, if you break a quarantine, basically they're going to put you to death. And then the New Orleans case, and then Jacobson versus Massachusetts, Gibbons versus Ogden, and the idea that basically the courts have given particularly the states a very broad field of power in order to establish quarantines and those types of things, and that we would have to look at those court cases if we were going to kind of look forward and try to determine what the courts would do, which I'm not sure if we can ever really do that. But, if we would have to look back at the precedent and say, hey, the courts, based on the rational basis, would probably say, yeah, the states have the power, because, in the Jacobson case, he didn't want to take the smallpox vaccine. And the Supreme Court said, no, you're taking the smallpox vaccine because it's in the interest of public health. And so we have to look at those types of things too.
I agree. Schechter, before we move on, we have one question. You didn't really explain what all these colors mean. And to be honest with you, I didn't understand what all the colors mean on this one. And just real quick, why is Nebraska red and Kansas gold and Iowa green? And, so forth.
The states that are gold have some measure of home rule. The states that are red are strictly Dillon's rule, and the states that are neither are purple.
Okay.
But let me go back to, let's just finish up the mask thing. Ken is spot on and you're spot on. And there seems to be some semblance of agreement within the public health community that masks are a good idea. Now they say masks are a good idea. If you can get one of those N something or others, that's a great idea. But if you just wear a kerchief like a bandito, that's not bad either. So the next question, why on earth aren't governments requiring people to wear masks? And this brings up a great principle of motivation of elected officials that I would like to take this opportunity to state. And that is, there's a real reason for everything as well as a good reason. So the good reason for government requiring people to wear masks is it's a good way of controlling the spread of COVID-19. That's the good reason. The real reason that public officials have to do something is, let's face it, and that is to get reelected. And And you know, their argument is, I'm not going to be able to accomplish anything if I'm not reelected. All those good things that we want to do are going to go by the wayside because I'm not going to be around to do them. And getting reelected requires me going out and campaigning with the people and getting feedback from them and talking with them, and that's what it's about too. So getting reelected isn't such a bad reason. It's just a real reason, right? So what's the real reason that's going to motivate politicians seeking reelection, requiring people, everybody, to wear masks? And there, I would expect the room, which is now 63 people, to fall suddenly silent, as it has. And no one's speaking up, which is perfectly understandable. When it comes to getting reelected, requiring people to wear masks is not what they call a win-win situation, right? It's going to have some wins, some losses, some uncertainty, and so on and so on and so forth. And there's another thing that's involved in how you're going to administer that. So the most sensible thing in some people's minds is, well, if we're going to have everybody wear masks, let the president pass an executive order that requires everybody to wear masks. Which begs the question, how's he going to administer that? I mean, imagine a Miami beach, right? They're out there, they're on the beach, they're not wearing masks. President's going to drive over from Mar-a-Lago and say, in his suit with his red tie and his hair flop. Nope, stop, Stephen. It's not going to happen. So why doesn't he make the executive order and require governors and local governments to administer it for him? Well, then it kicks into what we just went through, that federal government can't, quote unquote, commandeer the states or local governments into action. So maybe, I don't know, and talking about wanting re-election, if there's someone who really, 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 really wants re-election, the president's made no secret about that. So now what? Maybe it's a good idea to have the president require everybody to wear masks, but it's only a good idea. It's not a real idea, and it's not a practical idea, and it's not going to work, which it's not, which is why state and local governments get stuck doing this sort of thing all the time. Are states going to want to do that? Well, who are the states going to get to enforce it? They're going to get local law enforcement to enforce it, which they can do in most states, except complete home rule states. Well, in those complete home rule states, then the local governments are going to have to require the people to wear masks, because the state can't require the local government to enforce its laws. So you wind up with this patchwork, but don't ever put the word crazy in front of it again, because it's not so crazy. It makes some sense. My wife is telling me to hurry up. You're nodding your head, Thomas. Are we done with masks? No. Yes.
Yeah, we're done with masks for now. There are other sorts of questions that are popping up that I think you're going to get to on down the road here. So we'll continue on.
I feel like I've come to the end of my time. Did you want to talk about this religious just to quickly make the point on religious freedom, which is a complete departure, but it's a burning issue. I shouldn't use that, Bernie. I shouldn't use the word burning. I'm sorry. It's a lively issue. The court ruled in Prince versus Massachusetts way back in 1944 that freedom of religion does not extend to exposing the community to infectious diseases. The court has also ruled that when looking at gatherings that could spread infectious diseases, a government can't single out a religious gathering as opposed to any other kind of gathering. So the general consensus is that, yes, indeed, religious gatherings can be regulated in the interest of protecting the community from a public health threat, but not be singled out.
And what about guns?
What about guns? Is it fair that a gun shop is declared a non-essential service, pause, while Walmart is declared an essential service and can sell guns? I just leave that out there as a question.
That might bring up some equal protection
It
claims
does,
about
right?
the government's responses to COVID-19.
It might. It might.
What about cell phones?
What about cell phones, you ask?
Yeah.
There are technologies in development, none absolutely certain and out there as apps that absolutely positively work, that will do one of two things, that will locate people by their cell phones and will also measure the distance between people by their cell phones. Some countries have experimented with this. The question being, if you had this does the job in theory, does the job of what's called contact tracing. You may be slightly confused by reading some newspaper articles that have lousy tracking devices of them that call this contract tracing, because contract is a word, but it's contact tracing. Governments hire thousands and thousands and thousands of people to, by telephone, ask infected people to retrace their steps so that they can identify who else they might have come in contact with. That's contact tracing.
Okay, let's.
If you have a technology that can do that instead of the thousands of people, wouldn't it be a wise idea to rush to embrace that technology? Well, it requires, first of all, that everybody's got to have that app for it to work. And in the countries where, like France, where it's being used, people are reluctant to have that app for fear of having their privacy invaded. So instead of all of that, governments buy huge big data sets that are able to locate at least hotspots in their state, which is what they're doing now.
We only have 15 minutes left. I do want to save some time for questions. A whole list of possible challenges to action here. We've addressed some of them. Stephen recommends Jared Diamond's book, if you want to just say a word about it.
I'll say two words, that in the old days, teachers used to actually read a Diamond book, a Jared Diamond book, it's different from Marty, during the summer. The latest one is Upheaval. It looks at how countries respond to crisis. He concludes with a dozen lessons or so. Boiled down, those lessons aren't bad for this discussion. Lesson one is acknowledge that one is in a crisis. 2, accept responsibility for dealing with it rather than scapegoating others. 3, draw on historical experience in managing it. And finally, recognize the core values that you want to put in place in managing it. And those are 4 fairly good lessons to apply to this particular crisis.
Let's stop there. We are going to, Stephen's going to come back with us at the end tomorrow and talk for about 10 minutes on teaching about infusing public health into your curriculum. But we need to take time for a couple questions. I'll give you 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yes.
An issue we haven't talked about is separation of powers, particularly state governors. Have state governors, some state governors, use their emergency powers to excess, and what can be done to control that. And the National Conference of State Legislatures, which you can visit their website, has said, don't forget the state legislatures. State legislatures can easily pass laws, if they haven't done it already, that requires a governor to seek legislative reauthorization for their emergency powers every 30 days. It would keep governors, allow governors to do their job, but at least keep them constitutionally limited. Not a bad idea to consider. Thank you.
Perfect. We'll stop there. We have time for just a few questions. Again, if you have questions, to go ahead and type them into the Q&A or into the chat, either one. Let's talk about non-governmental responses to the crisis, or maybe citizen responses that are dependent upon information that we get from the government. There's a couple questions here about masks and how citizens deal with COVID-19 on their own terms. And the question is, basically, doesn't the government play a huge role, whether they mandate things or not? Doesn't the government, or shouldn't the government, play a huge role in educating the citizenry to a level that allows them to make wise decisions about mask wearing or social distancing? And in essence, have our governments done a good enough job doing that? And I guess, they would also, point to our president not wearing a mask and kind of being, in some ways against mask wearing. And, hasn't that had a negative effect on COVID and its spread?
Well, first things first, a public education is an essential part of the toolkit involved in controlling the spread of infectious diseases. It absolutely is. We all know that. It operates at a variety of levels, from guidelines that the CDC issues, that works its way out into the media and winds up getting published, to press conferences and public hearings in Congress and in state legislatures and in schools. We separate public education from schooling, but they're not. They really should not be separated. They are very, very important. Unfortunately, at the press conference level, public education has become politicized. And by politicized, I mean it goes back to the real reason of looking to get reelected and using press conferences as a campaign tool. And this is something that's been used by many, many, many public officials, not just by President Trump. And that's unfortunate. And it equally unfortunate when politicians contradict one another and contradict administrative scientists or scientific administrators like Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx and Dr. Redfield and so on. You just it sends out such mixed signals. People are so confused already that public education is a great thing to do, but if you're going to screw it up, don't do it at all, because it just mixes people up too much.
One quick follow-up, and then I'll turn things over to Ken and Robert and Matt for the final questions and final thoughts. You know, it seems to me if mask wearing is somewhat effective, if nothing else, from preventing the spread from an infected person to others, and you talked about politicians wanting to be reelected, and if reelection, no matter what level of government, is somehow linked to how well we do in fighting the COVID-19 problem, then why wouldn't it be in the best interest of all politicians at every level of government that wanted to be reelected to encourage mask wearing? Other countries do it, and people do it, and it's, you know, we've gone down a pathway now where people can't turn back from, perhaps, but it seems inconsistent. You know,
well, the answer is that mask wearing has become politicized. So the question is, how do you get it unpoliticized? How do you make it fashionable for those who are opposed to mask wearing for political reasons to gradually warm up to the idea of mask wearing? And that is, that's a tough question.
Okay, let's turn things over to Ken and Matt, and Robert. You can unmute yourselves, and we'll let you guys answer this next question, kind of as a transition to tomorrow night. And the question is, in terms of federalism, whose role is it to provide K-12 social studies education to our students? Are you concerned that these important lessons that we've been discussing will be given the space they need in classrooms because of federal legislation that brings mandatory 3.8 math and ELA testing more to the forefront?
In this whole process, we look at balancing situations. With the COVID, with federalism, what is the balance between the state and the national government? In the fundamental ideas and principles of our government, we look at unity versus diversity. One of the things that we have to look at, of course, in education is obviously what is the role of the state governments versus the national governments, and what is the role of the local governments. Here in the state of Kansas, you know, the catchphrase is always local control. That we don't want Topeka, Kansas telling us what to teach and those types of things. However, it's very important to understand that this is an entire balancing process. And we have to go ahead and think in terms of how to maintain that balance. And right now, education is in, unfortunately, much like our political situation and pretty much everything, right now education is on a pendulum swing from extreme to extreme. And so, the idea of the pendulum is that it's always looking to find equilibrium. But right now, when it's swinging from here to here, we go from No Child Left Behind, where there is a correct answer to every question, and that's a multiple choice test, and that answer is C. And I literally had students, upper level students, come up to me and ask about immigration as to what is the correct answer. And I tried to impart on them that, is there really a correct answer to the immigration issue that you can put your finger on? It's not C. You have No Child Left Behind, and then you have the swing to the extreme that we don't need to learn content, because everything that you can find out on Google, because we know everything is true that's on Google. And so, we're no longer looking for that balancing process. And when we're talking about the idea of federalism, we have to look specifically at what is the role of the national government versus the state governments versus the local governments. When we're looking at this process, we have to understand that by and large, the police powers were given to the states. And therefore, they have a very, very important role in this entire process. Whereas the national government has actually diminished police powers in this realm. And so, the president is actually more limited in what he can do through executive orders than a governor in a state. But the good thing is that, it's a thanks federalism situation, because you've got 50 different states with 50 different constitutions and 50 different powers within the executive branches of those states. And it's very difficult for them to go ahead and say, well, gee, what fits for Kansas works really well for New York. Well, that's why the idea that Louis Brandeis stated in his opinion that the states are the laboratories of democracies, that they're the ones who come up with these great ideas, and then they filter through the other states into the national government. So
Okay.
those are some of the things that we have to look at. Now, in this, John Meacham from Vanderbilt University, my son happens to go to Vanderbilt, and Meacham is a highly respected individual. His statement several weeks ago was that this pandemic is accelerating history almost exponentially, that everything is happening so much faster right now. And it is placing a spotlight on issues that were under the surface. They are now coming up and being spotlighted and becoming crisis situations. And I really believe that that's exactly what's happening. And I think the spotlight of education is now, people are all of a sudden realizing, oh my gosh, we need to teach history again. We need to deal with those situations. Instead of cutting history and humanities, we need to look at these things. We need to get people to actually work together and work in combination with each other and discuss these important processes.
Ken, I like that. I like the acceleration of history idea and bringing things to the surface. That's worth thinking about more. Robert, closing thoughts.
I love the question about the teacher's responsibility in teaching about federalism and or COVID-19 and the pressures they're going to have this fall. Certainly, if education is historically very locally controlled through school boards and such, states look at each other, as Ken said, they see they experiment and so forth. but the federal government, the national government, the Department of Education has some carrots to offer up, but I think mainly, and this is going to be a school system thing. Now, teachers, this is one of the reasons why I went into teaching, is because when I got into my classroom and closed that door, I realized, and was somewhat scared about it, that I had pretty much all the authority to take care of what's going to happen in my classroom. Now you might say, well, testing influences that and all this kind of stuff, and influences that. But I could make some choices about what I needed to do based on the situation. And let me just give you one that I was just thinking about. My second year of teaching was in an alternative school that was at the time called disadvantaged youth. These were kids thrown out of every high school in the city and sent to us and said, here, fix them. Well, sadly to say, every one of our young girls was either pregnant or already had a child, and the youngest was 12. We thought we needed to deal with that issue. So we decided to invite in Planned Parenthood to talk to our young girls. The administration had a fit about it. We asked them, should we do this? They said no. We met as a staff and decided they're wrong and we need to do this. We're just going to keep it quiet anyway. And so we brought them in to counsel these young girls on a variety of issues because we thought that was the crisis we wanted to deal with. What I'm saying to you as a teacher is, if you think this is an important issue to cover in your class, and I think you do because you're on this webinar, do it, and do it with intensity. And don't be afraid to take risks. We're all learning with what this is. If Dr. Fauci can change his mind, so can young people change their mind about how to assess this. In a country as free as ours, it really is the responsibility of the individual to decide whether to wear a mask or not. It's silly that it's political, and I question that a little bit. But the point is that we're free to be stupid and we're free to be smart. And guess what? I think teachers are in the perfect position to influence young people in how to be smart. So do it. And don't worry about the consequences, because if you think you're morally right and educationally right, then take the chance if you have to.
Just to be clear, Kansas State University supports being smart, but Kansas State University is not responsible if you go against your administration at any time during your teaching career. Just to be clear on that,
I hope you don't have that decision to make. I'm just saying I did at one time.
Yeah, and I could argue with you a little bit, Robert, on the idea of masks and freedom and so forth. And you know, I love liberty and I love freedom, and it's awesome. But when your freedom and potentially imposes a life risk, really, with COVID on somebody else, then shouldn't the power of government, a reasonable position could be, we need to use the power of government for exactly and precisely things like this.
This may be the exception to what the rule in my mind, because I don't need a law that says I shouldn't do certain things. Because
we have laws that for a lot of things.
I know that, but I'm saying that, do we need a law? It should be a matter of an intelligent choice versus being told to do it. Again, somebody brought up seatbelts or helmet laws. Well, that's my choice. I mean, the difference is you're going to affect your own person and not the other person. But now it seems absurd that we actually need a law that tells you to wear a seatbelt, because it's just common sense now. I understand it from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. So once it gets into the mentality of ourselves, we can self-control ourselves on this. And what I'm saying ultimately is teachers should not feel inhibited to express what is smart to do, especially when, as Stephen said, the school systems are going to be worried about kids coming to school and going home and infecting grandma. All right. that needs to be talked about, it seems to me. And also, here's the ultimate question. Should teachers tell their students to wear masks this fall?
Just real quick, and I know we're out of time, participants, but in the chat, answer that question. Should teachers tell students to wear masks? They'll probably be.
Or a better word, encourage, like the national government's doing, all right? I see that they have tenure.
Tenure. That's cool.
There are times, that tried men's souls, and we're in one of them right now.
Right.
And teachers are going to have to look deep into themselves and their souls and ask some important questions, because they have influence over young people. That's a huge power to demonstrate, like the national government having power on us. So you have a responsibility as well as an understanding of all this. And it seems to me, if you go through part of what Stephen has done in the last 3 days as a lesson, when you put together a lesson for this, the students will come to that conclusion on their own. You won't have to tell them to wear a mask. It'll be obvious.
I think.
Okay, let's Matt Christensen, who, by the way, had this the idea for this webinar to begin with. It came from Matt. You definitely get the last word tonight, and we'll hear more from you tomorrow.
I think what's awesome about, thank you. I think what's awesome about the conversation you've heard tonight, the amazing stuff you've heard from Stephen and from the information, the conversation they just had there, is that one of the concerns that we have as teachers going back into the classroom with the COVID opportunity, whether that means in some kind of mixed opportunity of hours you're in your class, or whether it's online or blended, or all the words that are being thrown out right now, is that the concern for a lot of people is how do you keep kids engaged when they are disconnected from that personal relationship. And I think what's awesome about the conversation we've had tonight, it's what's awesome about these topics, it's what's awesome about We the People, which Ken and I are excited to share more with you about next time, is that it naturally gets people engaged. It naturally keeps people engaged and wants them to know more when they are understanding how they can have a role in it, and they can then apply. Tonight, you heard in the earlier sessions historical information. You heard great constitutional information. You heard great theory being proposed tonight. And the conversation you just heard was all of those things meshed together. And I think if we're really going to succeed in helping kids being able to be empowered in the future, it's going to take all three of those pieces coming together. And so that's what I think is awesome about this program. I think it's awesome about what we've seen already. It's the conversation that Ken and I started about having this opportunity to have this with teachers, is that I hope that when you come back with us next time, tomorrow night, it's a chance for us to show you how to do that with your classes. Not only just to show you, but to ask questions. I know a lot of you that are on this conversation right now are in classrooms and are doing that already. And so we'd love to next time just talk about how that works. Because, man, there's nothing better than getting a kid just totally jazzed up when they don't want to leave the room. They don't want to stop the conversation because they know what they're learning is so powerful. And you can see how powerful these guys are and how much passion they have for it. We just need more kids with that kind of passion. And I think they'll come to their own answers. I agree with I think they're going to come to their own answers, and I think they'll find those. And they may be different, but they'll find them based in some kind of historical fact and some kind of power. And so I really appreciate everybody coming tonight, and I look forward to next week having that conversation with you.
Fantastic, Matt. Thank you so much for this great idea. Ken, thank you so much for all that you've added to these webinars and the support. Robert from the Center for Civic Education, and putting your name behind these webinars has been a huge help, and we'll hear more from you tomorrow. But more than anybody, I want to thank Dr. Schechter, who spent, hours and hours and days. If you have not had a chance to go through his big, huge outline and click on some of the links, it is just so extraordinarily well done, and will be a great resource for you and your students, and hopefully for hundreds, if not thousands, of folks across the United States. And again, we're going to try to make it an ebook as well, to make it really easy for your kids to click on and so forth. So Dr. Schechter, I can't thank you enough. We will finish up tomorrow with talking about how this all translates, how these ideas and knowing something about the political concepts, knowing something about the history, diving in, taking a deep dive into a current event, how that is manifest in the We the People program. So Dr. Schechter, last word. You unmuted yourself. Do you have one more word? Or wait until tomorrow?
Just thank you. And I did not want to indicate that I believe that politicians should follow their self-interest and their reelection. I wish they would rise above it on occasion, and this would be one of those occasions.
And you know, one of the things that maybe not everyone recognizes, but Dr. Schechter, you did such a remarkable job of taking a current issue in a, let's be honest, a politically polarized environment and being able to think through it in a nonpartisan way. And I hope all of the participants don't think, well, geez, this is a conservative thing or a liberal thing, because it's really not. To be in truth, the people that put this together are a mixture of political ideologies. And so I want to especially thank you for that. From Wamigo, we will see you again tomorrow, same time, same place, and I'll send out the last set of resources tomorrow. And thanks so much for coming, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.